Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. Joining me today in our studio to discuss the controversy surrounding Ms. Eileen Gu's identity is Dr. Mike Gow, assistant professor at Edge Hill University Business School. Before we get started, Mike, can you please introduce yourself and your work to our audience a little bit? Specifically, what got you interested in studying China?
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me on to discuss this issue. And my current research here at Edge Hill University focuses on the role of consumerism and citizenship in contemporary China. So I'm particularly interested in the relationship between consumerism and cultural industries, including sports and state building projects in China. But my initial interest in China came back in 2003, 2004, when I was studying international business, and I went to Shanghai and I studied Mandarin at Fudan University. And since then, my interest in and relationship with China has developed quite a lot. And I spent a long time in China, roughly from 2004 to 2018. And particularly around this issue, my real interest is that I have an 8-year-old son who is whose mother is originally from Shandong province in mainland China. So this issue of nationality and citizenship, it's something that's of particular interest to me personally.
I see. Fantastic. So, Mike, you wrote a very insightful Twitter thread on the sort of the controversies and intricacies of nationality and citizenship controversy. Can you first please help us understand the difference between nationality versus citizenship?
Sure, and I think this is one of the most confusing aspects of this whole discussion and debate. So, in common sense terms, these two terms, nationality and citizenship, tend to be used interchangeably. So it's a lot of the time when people talk about what nationality somebody is, they actually are referring to citizenship. And similarly, we see the other way around as well. When we talk about somebody being a citizen, sometimes we can actually be referring to whether they're a national of the country or not. So I think citizenship is probably the best starting point for us to think about the difference between these two terms. And citizenship is a status which conveys certain rights, responsibilities, duties on an individual. And it's a formal legal relationship between an individual and a political entity, so usually a nation or a city-state. But nationality is a bit more of a broader concept. It's less about what you are, less about you being a subject with any freedoms, rights, or responsibilities or duties. And it's more about who you are. And I think that's probably the best way to frame it if we're trying to distinguish any difference between these two terms. So nationality is more a concept related to your identity and who you are, though it's still distinct from other concepts such as ethnicity and race. So when we think about citizenship, if you're a citizen of a country or a certain city-state, for example, you have certain rights. You can register your children for schools. You can get a passport for that country. You can, in certain countries, you can vote in elections and vote for elected representatives. You have certain rights as a citizen. But as a national, that might not always be the case. And if you're a national of a country, it's more about your identity. Mm-hmm. You can be a national through being born in a country, in which case, more often than not, you'd also be a citizen. But also you can be a national through ancestry, through blood relationships. So if your parents were born in a country, you could be a national of that country as well. And I think this is something that's particularly evident of all the countries in the world. Mm-hmm. I think the United States of America is one where citizenship and nationality often exist side by side quite comfortably. So yes, most of my American friends, they identify, of course, as Americans, as citizens of the United States of America, but often they'll describe themselves as Chinese American or Korean American or Irish American or Italian American. Right. And that sense of nationality is still very strong with a lot of people and a lot of communities across the United States. So I think that's how we have to distinguish them. Citizenship is a sort of formal legal relationship, and nationality is much more tied in to who you are and your actual identity.
I see. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. But I wonder if you can elaborate a bit more on the notion of Chinese nationality specifically. So what actually constitutes a Chinese national? And is the concept static, or has the concept changed over the years?
So this is quite a complex question. I think we probably need to look at it from two different perspectives. The first is the personal perspective, and the second is maybe the political. So from a personal perspective, a Chinese national can be anyone who has a clear, meaningful, authentic relationship with China. And what we mean by China doesn't just mean the Chinese mainland or the People's Republic of China. This could be somebody who was born in China or in any territories such as Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, or anybody who has ancestral ties to China via their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, or maybe that they're members of the Chinese diaspora communities around the world, for example, in New York City. But many people who have Chinese nationality also have other nationalities. So in New York, for example, you have large communities who identify as Chinese American, Korean American, Italian American. These all members of these communities have at least two nationalities, but they may only be citizens of the US. So I think on a personal level, Chinese nationality is tied into your identity, who you are, where you're from, where your family is from. But it's not maybe a formal citizenship link to either the mainland or to another territory such as Taiwan or Hong Kong permanent resident. But then we have this other question around political. And this is something that when you look at a lot of dialogue and discourse, particularly that emanating from mainland China, from the People's Republic of China, this idea of Chinese nationality is very expansive and broad. Anybody of Chinese heritage is seen as being part of this wider Chinese nationality. So it's a bit of a difficult question to answer, and it's difficult to pin down. But your question, has this concept changed over the years? Is I think the issue of Chinese nationality specifically is something that is being contested on a political level by the Chinese authorities in the PRC. So this is maybe what's causing some of the confusion here.
Right. And, in addition to sort of the controversy surrounding citizenship and nationality, there was this one statement from the Chinese consulate in New York, which really puzzled a lot of us, myself included. So basically, in response to BBC's question on Ms.谷爱凌's nationality or citizenship, the consulate states that athletes who obtain Chinese green card but not full citizenship can still compete for China. And that certainly puzzled a lot of people. Does that signal a broader trend of China moving away from its strict legal citizenship requirement and, more proactively recruiting talents from abroad, perhaps not just in sports, but also in arts, science, and other fields?
Certainly, there's the issue of permanent residency, or what's referred to as a green card in China, but the permanent residence card. So this is a policy, part of the immigration policy that's managed under the Entry-Exit Bureau in mainland China. And it's gone through a series of revisions over the last few years. Most recently, there's some new draft regulations that have been discussed that set certain conditions to encourage talented people to move to China and to take up permanent residency. Sometimes after a qualifying period, it depends on their own personal circumstances. So I think that there's a bit of an issue that we've got to be careful with here, is not to conflate immigration status with an eligibility to represent a country at a major sporting event. So I don't see any indication at the moment that China is softening its immigration laws, and certainly not in relation to citizenship. But it is developing policies that encourage migration of talented people to China under permanent residency. But I don't think there's any requirement, really. There's two separate issues. So your immigration status or your citizenship status is almost a separate issue from whether you are eligible to represent China in sporting events. The Chinese government doesn't decide that as such. It lays the stipulations for immigration requirements, but it's the governing bodies of the specific sports and the National Olympic Committee, the International Olympic Committee. They're the ones that decide whether somebody can represent a country, international sporting events or not. So I think we've got to be very careful here not to conflate these two issues, immigration status and eligibility to represent a country at major sporting events.
Right. And next, I wanted to turn to sort of the media attention surrounding Ms. Eileen Gu. As you know, here in the United States, we have certain right-wing media outlets accusing her of being a traitor, right? The Communist Party puppet. And in China, we have some ultra-nationalistic Chinese outlet label her as kind of a patriot who gave up the cushion life in the United States to reunite with the motherland. And I think those are, the polar extremes, definitely not the majority. But how do you think is Ms. Gu's success actually perceived by the general Western public and by the general Chinese public?
Okay, I don't think I can confidently say what the general sentiment is that's held by people in either the West or in China. Mm-hmm. However, you're quite right. It's very clear that there are different varieties of hostility towards Gu Ailing with varying levels of intensity. So one comparison that's been made, obviously, is with, in certain sections, is with Chen Xuesen, the scientist who was actually placed under house arrest for many years in the 1950s during the McCarthyist campaigns, and then returned to China afterwards to become a very successful scientist I think he was literally a rocket scientist. But that, I think, is a very different example. I don't think it's an appropriate comparison. It's a very different time, very different set of circumstances. And what led to him returning was a consequence of particular ideological and possibly anti-Asian sentiment in the US at that time. But I think this idea that Gu Ailing is a traitor to the United States for wanting to represent a country which she clearly has a very, very strong connection with through her mother and has spent a lot of time in China, and is herself of mixed nationality. So I think that there's this idea that she's a traitor itself says more about the people making those allegations, that you have to pick a side, than it does about Gu Ailing herself. I also think that there's no, it's important to point out that there's no requirement really for citizenship in order to represent a nation state at sports. Those regulatory bodies are the ones that set the conditions of eligibility. And what they do is they set that standard very high. So they might say that you need to provide a passport, or they might use the term citizenship instead of nationality. But what they then do is that anybody that wishes to represent a country that then fails that initial test, they will assess on a case-by-case basis. So what they do not do is they do not set conditions whereby they say, if you satisfy these conditions, you are eligible to represent. They set a very high bar in order to make sure that anybody that wants to represent that country has a genuine connection with that country. And this is set up deliberately to stop this marketization of athletes, where offering citizenship to an athlete is a way to get top athletes to come and represent your country, even when they have no real connection there. On the other side, in China, there's this sort of celebratory kind of homecoming sort of attitude towards Gu Ailing, and I think that is. I would be interested to see, hypothetically, what would have happened if Gu Ailing had represented the United States. I think the vast majority of Chinese people would still have some level of celebration for that, and it would not be viewed negatively. But obviously, there's a great amount of pride there is in the fact that she has won gold in probably the most exciting fashion she could have done in that first event with the final jump. And yeah, I think that this is something that people in China generally are going to be happy to see. It's quite an important event.
What strikes me as interesting is how Ms. Gu has been deliberately vague when asked about her citizenship. Clearly, she understands the potential controversy surrounding that. I wonder, are there potential legal or financial complications beyond the sport itself that might be in store for her, as far as you can tell?
So I think a couple of points that I just want to, my own personal views on this is, I think in Gu Ailing's case, her citizenship is a private and personal matter, and it's nobody's concern really. The issue here is that China's nationality law, which they use the term nationality law, but it's actually a law specifically on citizenship. It seems to prevent, except in certain cases, anybody holding dual citizenship. So this is something that a lot of people are talking about. So I don't think Gu Ailing owes anybody an explanation on her decisions around citizenship, I certainly think that the PRC authorities deserve people deserve an explanation from the PRC authorities on whether there's been any exceptions made to the PRC nationality law. I think that definitely is a bone of contention for a lot of people, because it seems, and this is based on assumptions about Gu Ailing's actual citizenship status, that some kind of exception or bending of the rules has occurred. So I think there's an explanation that's deserved there, but that's not from Gu Ailing, that's from the PRC authorities themselves. And I also think that the International Ski Federation, the FIS, China's National Olympic Committee and the IOC, they owe everyone some kind of clarification on how and why decisions are made where competitors do not hold citizenship of the country that they represent. And there are many, many cases of this happening in all sports. But it's an incredibly complex situation, particularly now. I mean, maybe 100 years ago, this wouldn't have been so much of an issue. But now in the era of globalization, you have families that are split across national borders. You have mixed, multicultural families. There's a huge amount of complexity to people's identity and therefore also to their citizenship status. But I think the sports authorities could clarify quite easily how and why certain athletes qualify to represent those nation states. Coming back to the legal or financial complications, there are certain potential issues. So, for example, for US citizens, wherever they live in the world, they are liable for US taxes. So obviously one implication with Gu Ailing representing China, and this has been quite a criticism that's leveled at her as well, as this sort of mercenary sports person who's looking to leverage her popularity in China and the US to earn more money through sponsorship deals. There's certain possible tax implications there for Gu Ailing. I don't know, because we simply don't know exactly what her citizenship status is. My own personal view is that I personally think that she will have retained US citizenship and that she will have secured permanent residency in the People's Republic of China. But I also think it's important to point out that Gu Ailing would very likely qualify for naturalization under the PRC nationality law. The problem that she's faced with, and this is a problem that faces a huge number of people who are originally from mainland China who have emigrated overseas, is that they have to make a decision. That's a decision they're kind of forced to make at some point because of the PRC nationality law. So she's in a very difficult spot. Hypothetically, if we were to suggest, what if the People's Republic of China did recognize dual citizenship or did allow dual citizenship, would we still be having this conversation? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think, as you've highlighted, there's a sort of hostility on one side in terms of this traitor accusation. There's a hostility on another side in terms of this sort of mercenary accusation that the谷爱凌is just trying to make money. And I think those are the issues that most people are concerned about. And those but those would not be issues if China recognized dual citizenship.谷爱凌would still be allowed to compete, but we'd still be talking about this. So the legal financial complications, there will be some there. I have no doubt about that. But for me personally, looking at this, I think谷爱凌has made a difficult decision on a personal level. I'm sure she feels as much Chinese as she does American, and has made a decision to represent China. That's her decision. I think she's a pretty good role model for kids and for families with children who have this mixed identity. I don't think she should be forced or compelled to choose who she is, and I think that's probably the fairest way to look at this issue. And there's no doubt she could have represented either the US or China, and both would be absolutely legitimate decisions made by谷爱凌in this case.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Mike Gow. We're so good to have you here today. Thank you so much and have a good rest of the day.
感谢您来到由我Lizzi 为您带来的今日华尔街频道。在看过节目之后，如果喜欢，请别忘了为节目点赞，也请您在留言区留下您对节目的见解和意见。如果您是频道会员的话，我们会在第一时间回复您的留言，解答您的疑问。另外，如果还没有订阅的话，请记得要订阅频道，并且打开订阅按钮旁边的小铃铛，这样您就可以在第一时间收到节目发布的最新信息了。再次感谢您观看今日华尔街频道，我是Lizzi，我们下次再会。